Thank you very much.
Right at the end.
Wonderful to be here with such a talented and distinguished group of investors. Perhaps best to start on the far end with Murielle, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and your fund.
Sure.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Mano. Murielle McLane. I'm a director at Intuitive Ventures. So we're the strategic venture capital arm of Intuitive, and we invest in Series A and B. We have a $100 million asset under management. Series A and B in medtech broadly, digital health and diagnostic, really looking at expanding the ecosystem of minimal invasive care. I'm actually an operator and an entrepreneur background, so I've been in your seat.
Hi there, my name is Janke Dittmer. I'm general partner at Gilde Healthcare, lead the European health tech activities. So that's medtech, digital health, diagnostics, and life science tools. We are Transatlantic Venture and Growth Capital Fund with $2.5 billion under management. We just raised our sixth fund, close to 700 million euros. And I think being transatlantic is very close to our heart as our investment thesis. We have an office in Boston and representatives across the US. In health tech, we invest about one half of our funds in the US and the rest in Europe. I'm originally a scientist turned entrepreneur, turned corporate venture capitalist, a bit of consulting in between, and now for 12 years have been doing this. And as you will find out, have some history actually with some of the people on the panel here.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Sascha. I'm a general partner at TVM. TVM Capital is a fund with a long history. We're also in this business for 40 years. Right now, we're investing out of a $500 million fund with a transatlantic team, so team members in North America and in Europe. I am personally based in Munich, and we're investing a significant portion of that capital into devices and other late-stage opportunities in diagnostics and digital health. Typically, 10 to 20 million would be our preferred ticket size. And my background is in chemistry and finance, and I've spent 10 years in different industry roles before joining TVM 7 years ago.
Thank you, Sascha. Mano Iyer, I'm an American who's been bouncing around Europe for a long time, so not sure where home is anymore. Physically based just out of Amsterdam right now. With Sofinnova, Sofinnova is a 50-year-old venture capital firm, about 500 companies invested since 1972, 2.5 billion euros assets under management right now, 100 active portfolio companies, 6 different funds from early-stage medtech to late-stage life sciences, including industrial biotech, and a new exciting digital medicine fund. I think the partner Simon Turner is on a couple of panels here, so exciting new opportunities there. I think as everyone's looking at digital these days. So, want to make this useful for everyone. I'm an entrepreneur at heart, spent most of my career doing that, and want to build off of our friends on the previous panel to expand the scope from Europe to the US as well. And maybe the caveat here is, obviously we know that neither the Europe nor the US are homogeneous from a cultural standpoint, personality standpoint, or healthcare delivery model standpoint, but let us proceed to grossly oversimplify things. Just from a show of hands, from an audience standpoint, who's raising money right now? Is anyone raising money? All right, half the audience is in denial because you're actually always raising money. You just don't know it. How many folks are in Europe? From Europe? And keep your hands up. How many people are having a hard time raising money in Europe? Okay. Well, I just want to get a sense of things. Just from my entrance to lunch about an hour ago, I bumped into 4 different, I think, entrepreneurs, and I got the full range of, the market's not so bad, the market's okay, the market's harsh, and I'm not sure what the market is right now. So would love to ask all of you your perspectives. Obviously, we came out of 10, 12, 13 years of exciting growth. Had easy money, SPACs, the world was going really well up until 2021. We ran into a wall of, inflation, bank insolvency, global political issues, and so forth. But you just announced your funds. We're all actively investing out of funds. So what's the state of investing in your perspective in medtech? And Murielle, would you mind? I mean, you're with Intuitive. It's an internal fund, but maybe you could talk a bit about your perspective, you being the only one in the US at the moment.
Yeah. So for us, I would say I shouldn't say we love it, but it's actually as a strategic fund, we tend to be more conservative maybe than some of the froth that we've seen in the last few years. So this has been a great time. We've been very active. And so we continue to invest and see a lot of really, really good deals. So I would say there is money. Most of our portfolio, we have 9 portfolio companies right now. 5 of them raised this year. We've seen them having no problem raising, even at better valuation than expected. So money is there. It's really about presenting differentiated ideas to people like us, and I would say as a strategic, being in a more rational time frame from an investor standpoint is really helpful. And you'll see we're working with a lot of active people, such as people on the panel, and as long as you're presenting correctly your idea, you'll find interest. It might take a little longer. Rounds are closing. We're taking a little bit more time in due diligence, but rational money is here and here to stay.
Janke, you've done a wonderful job raising funds, difficult times, easier times. Now again, COVID, and this year you guys have done an amazing job raising funds. What's your perspective now? You've invested in early, late, U.S., EU. Have things changed for you?
I think raising a fund is always difficult, right? That's for sure. But if I compare the 4 fundraisings that I've done in 2009 and 2015, 16, and then 2020 and today, clearly the 2009 to 11 was the hardest. Even though this was our 3rd fund, we had a long history as an institution at the time. I think the 2016 one was the 2nd hardest, and it turned out to be a very good vintage. The 2020 raise was the easiest by far. I think for the first time doing it all by Zoom, we were done in 3 months, raising over 400 million. And this time, I think it became harder again, but I think there's still money out there. So that's on the fund side. For the companies, I think we are in a very unique situation where there's entrepreneurs out there that actually don't really remember the old times, good or bad, but the normal times. And if I kind of just cut out the 6 trillion that were injected into the US economy between 2020 and 22, and look at the effect of that, which could go nowhere except for a few sectors, including healthcare. If you take that anomaly out, we're sort of back to sort of the old normal. So we're back on top of the good times of pre-COVID, but it's not treating every subsector equally. I think that's really important. And even within MedTech, which is what this conference is all about, I think it's become a lot more selective. I think in 2021, 2020, we saw a lot of companies get financed. Now, I think the really good companies are still finding it not too difficult. It's competitive. But if you have difficulties in your business model, you don't have reimbursement lined up, it's really challenging, then the fundraising has become much more challenging for those companies.
Just covered the rest of the panel in your topics, but
sorry.
We'll come back to that. Great. Sascha, what's your perspective here?
Actually, I think that's totally also my perspective. The markets are more rational maybe these days. To the comment Janke said before, I think there were a few years of irrational markets. So everyone was chasing deals. It was extremely competitive. Valuations were not necessarily based by fundamentals. So we had a challenging time also investing because we were not moving with the flow, so to say. So for us, getting back to, let's say, more normal markets actually is easier now. Discussing with founders next steps, being rational about spendings, how to invest, cash reach, and all those elements which were basically not a point for discussion 2 years ago because the next IPO was just half a year away. I don't think it's a bad time today, but I fully agree with Janke. It's become more selective. So those companies who are fulfilling a lot of these typical criteria will find investors. It may take a bit longer, but they will find them. And for those companies which were maybe more ambitious, more and have not standard business plans and elements which are certainly more risky, that's more challenging to find a broader set of investors these days.
So you've all touched on, I think, obviously the entrepreneurs from some standpoint. Maybe we can dive into that a little bit. I mean, and of course, building on the previous panel, the cultural differences here. I mean, I think we're supposed to juxtapose EU versus US, and I mean, there's, imagine some element of valuation here, right, in the discussions you're having and what you find as an attractive investment to make. And do you feel like there are differences you've experienced as you talk to founders, CEOs of these companies, and is that part of the challenge from a valuation standpoint, or other cultural differences you think that you found have come up in these discussions more recently that are maybe different from before, or characteristics of these conversations? I don't know if... Janke, I'll go back to you.
Yeah, I'm happy to start, be a little bit provocative.
Yeah.
We have the story that, when we have companies pitch at our office and there's a European entrepreneur, you come out of it, totally drained of energy, and you think like, oh, well, it's going to be really hard for these guys. And then someone, in maybe the associate in the room saying, but that IP that they have, I think that could be really key. And somebody else will say, well, but the clinical data, I think they were really smart about how they set up their RCT, and I think they're going to get there. And then you think, well, it's actually not so bad. Let's have another look at it. And then you got the American company present, and we're going out, fully energized. They go, wow, super presentation, really impressive. And then you walk out of the meeting, and then again, the same associate said, but did you look at the IP, right? And, what about that reimbursement code? There is a code, but, you have to toggle, and it's never going to work, right? And the whole thing sort of starts crumbling down. So I think sometimes it would be good to have sort of more of that sort of optimistic spirit on the European presentations, entrepreneurs being more daring, more aggressive in their growth plans, and inject sometimes a little bit more realism in these sort of slick presentations we see from the US. That's the stereotype. It is surprisingly true still, although especially in digital health, which we also invest in, we see that there's a new generation of sort of international leaders that are much less distinguishable, but entrepreneurs in medtech are much more mature, and there the distinction is still very, very much alive.
I mean, one of the challenges here from traditional medtech, digital health, if you will, is the experience of the team, right? And I think there's been a dearth of that, at least senior executive talent in Europe for a long time. I think that's changing. It's improving in different pockets around Europe. Of course, we have the pockets, in the U.S. I mean, Murielle, what are you seeing as you invest, from a U.S.-based fund here? How do you think about, as you invest in teams in the U.S. versus in Europe, and how do you kind of compare and contrast the experience that you're seeing?
So medtech, digital, different, I would say. First of all, so I'll echo what Vijay said. So in the digital health ecosystem, it tends to be very young CEOs that are in Europe and want to conquer the world or conquer pan-Europe. And there, usually we have discussions of what that may mean over time, and that they may not be the CEO forever. And that's a really important part of our evaluation criteria, is seeing who can take the company to where, and how willing are they to work with us to kind of get to the next expansion. On the medtech side, in Europe, there's an ecosystem that's been here for a long time on the technical side. And the question then becomes, how do you augment it to go to the US? So it's not sufficient to just have one employee in the US that's just a commercial, and it's not how success has been built. So again, lots of discussion of how they're thinking about the US. And for us, it's about how the team can grow to the US market. How can we help them think about it, particularly around regulatory, which the previous panel was talking about. And then also from a KOL and sort of go-to-market deployment.
I mean, from an entrepreneur standpoint, maybe I can bring up my own experience here, which I actually had with Janke at Gilde. About 4 or 5 years in, we received a term sheet, or we had the framework for a term sheet in place. And, when I started the company, I had an honest conversation with Antoine at Sofinnova saying, well, at some point, I may not be the right person to run this company. That's okay. And then over the course of the next few years, you have many near-death experiences, and you're humbled in many ways. And what was left of my ego was further trampled upon when, Gilde said, well, we'll invest in Recor, but I think we need to find a better CEO. Well, better wasn't the right word. I think, someone with more experience, which I think was appropriate. And it was absolutely fair, right? And looking ahead and what was needed for the company was someone who had that commercial experience and looking ahead to raise a lot of money, likely in the public markets. But when it actually hits you in the face, it's a different situation than when you're trying to think about it and plan for it up front. So I'm curious how many conversations you've had. I know, Murielle, you came in, actually you were brought in as someone with operating experience, right, to replace an existing CEO. So are you having these conversations with your potential investments and with founders or CEOs who you think may need to be replaced in the future? I know it's a very sensitive topic and a challenging one. Now, Sascha, have you faced this?
Of course, I think every investor has faced it. And as you say, it's a very sensitive topic for obvious reasons. So what we try to do is have an open conversation before we invest, because, that's part of the thesis, so to say, that we also, review the management team and the capabilities and then see what, from our perspective, would be a good way forward. And at least test at that point the willingness of people to either step back or step aside. It must not necessarily be that you leave the company, right? But maybe that you just step aside and you bring on board somebody else who can take on the company for the next development phase and bring it to the next value inflection points. And that works good or not so good, and that's also an indicator whether we want to invest or not. So if that is already complicated when you talk about it, then most likely will not be easier if you're in the company, so then most likely we will rather shy away from it. But maybe just from going back to that European versus US perspective, sometimes there's the great idea to have a European company entering the US market, and as said before, you need people on the ground in the US, so maybe hire a US CEO for that type of operation. That can be very good. We had examples in the past where it actually worked extremely well, but it's also challenging then from an intra-company cultural perspective, right? Having someone who's maybe brought in, who's a bit detached, sitting in the US, trying to move that company to become more US-focused is not an easy task. So on paper, this sounds great because it does everything, right? It's the European R&D and basics and the US capital markets focused CEO, but that's too often just a dream, to be honest, than reality to make that happen. So yeah.
Janke, have you experienced it as you've built and scaled companies from Europe to the US? What's your perspective here?
There's no formula for making it happen. I think the old adage, if you want to really understand the market, you need to immerse yourself in it. It's still true. So I've admired founders who basically packed their bags and said, okay, I need to go to the CEO. I'm actually going to move there. And by and large, they did pretty well in doing so and learning. The other part is like the sort of courageous conversations that need to go on at the board level and in the one-on-ones with the founders before you invest, while you invest. And I think we've come out of a period that was very founder-friendly, where I think some investors have shied away from those conversations, and it's not always in the best interest of the company and the founder actually themselves. So I think this is something that for the entrepreneurs in the room, it's important to look out for, that you don't have someone who just agrees with you, but basically brings, in that situation, sort of truth to power. That's really important, that somebody is authentic, tells you something that you may not want to hear at that point in time, but then you find a solution together, whether it's via coaching or support. Like sometimes you have a really good CEO, but he can't take the company all the way. Well, then you put in an executive chairman and you put in a COO next to them who've done it before, and together the three of them can actually make it. Or you basically have a chief commercial officer who kind of becomes the external face of the company and more of a COO who's the internal face of the company. So all of those creative options are possible. What I've seen in the last few years, though, is that there's increasing maturity of the entrepreneurs in Europe, where they actually realize that maybe they're not the right kind of profile to scale up a company. And they come to that conclusion because they're a large shareholder. They want to be successful. They want the company to be successful. And that makes the transition much more collaborative, ultimately. As I think there is data showing that 90% of the early stage CEOs will not be the right CEOs for the scale up. Mm-hmm. And I think just speaking that out, there's not failure, right? You've taken a company to where it is today. That's a great achievement. And now it's a different stage. Maybe you can stretch yourself, but a lot of the company CEOs and founders that I've worked with actually don't like the scale up phase anymore. So, it's actually very different. So I think that's a very important conversation to have. And, if you have none of those conversations right now, you need to maybe think about getting other investors into your board.
That's actually really well said. And I have to close the loop on our story. I mean, I think it was the best decision I ever made to step back and find someone who had a lot more experience. I learned a ton from him, Andy Weiss, and became a mentor to me. And I realized I really love early stage medtech, and the governance is critical in building and scaling a company, but maybe that wasn't necessarily for me. So it's difficult in the moment, but I mean, I think having that objectivity as an investor is critical, and being able to engage in those difficult conversations. And Murielle, maybe we can shift to business models to some degree. It feels like, and you've touched on it a little bit with regards to, there's a lot more money now in Europe, through grants and other aspects, and just venture capital funds investing. Of course, during the intro, they mentioned a lot more money is being raised in the United States. But from a traditional, say, medical device therapeutic standpoint, the model is to go do your first-in-human study in the east part of Europe, at least the countries that are open, and then go to the U.S. because the U.S. is open. It's it's a centralized market. It's FDA is very friendly, and MDR is gray and messy. And then if you get through that process and get CE mark, you still need to navigate, country by country reimbursement, right? So Europe is not homogeneous anymore. I mean, is that the model? I mean, what's the counter view? What's a better model? And what are you seeing as you look for investments in these areas?
Yeah, so we're seeing a lot of that model these days, frankly. And one of the things that we've seen, though, is a lot of European companies think they can take their first-in-human from Eastern Europe and then bring it to the US and say, hey, we can use some of that. And the reality, no, it's an early signal, but then you need to replicate everything back. So there's still, sort of that hurdle or that education that we're seeing. But by and large, for us, we're seeing a lot of companies that are bypassing Europe and going directly to US. And frankly, because of where we are also, US market is one that we look that we'll look up as how that company will scale in the US. And reimbursement is an interesting one because people tend to think, well, the US is one market, right? It's not. It's far from that. And you can go at it different ways depending on Are you selling to health system, IDNs? Are you selling to at-risk system? Are you selling to Medicare, or is it going to be a private payer? So there's a lot of education that needs to happen, as well as the companies are going to the US, that they may think about how they position themselves, both on the digital, frankly, and the medtech side.
Janke, I mean, you have experience here also, right, in terms of these traditional kind of medtech therapeutic business models. What's your experience up until now, and how are you considered from a valuation standpoint? You know, how do you think about investing at what stage? What are the clearer milestones, if you will? And I don't know, what's the role of strategics, if you want to kind of throw that into the mix here?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, but I think over time you see a back and forth here. So when I entered the VC world, the FDA was really difficult, and everyone tried to avoid the FDA as long as possible, and tried to maybe be acquired based on European approval, European revenue. And actually, a lot of medtech investors, when we went big into health tech and medtech, actually exited the space because they felt like this is impossible. So that's not so long ago, right? We're talking 15 years, and now we're in a different phase where through all sorts of questionable reasons, you can't fight fraud with regulation, in my view. But we are ending up with a bunch of rules in Europe that are almost as tough as the US, in some ways maybe even tougher. And then a lot of execution challenges that hopefully are transitory in nature, that we don't have enough notified bodies. And there's less predictability right now in terms of the pathway length in Europe than there ever used to be in the US, right? Even in the worst times. So we've come to a point where recently we had a company propose to us that they would go to Europe first, and they got a lot of pushback, right? So what's the investment case around it? It's really sad as a European citizen. I feel like we're letting down patients all over Europe because they're not going to have the newest and the latest devices in 5 years' time. This cannot remain like that. It's just we have to do something. I'm convinced that we'll find a way to make the pendulum swing back. But for now, right, it's really difficult. I cannot advise a company to go into this sort of uncertain adventure in Europe when the market is bigger and more straightforward, and there's an EFS, and there's a breakthrough designation, and all sorts of accelerated paths to go to the US. I think at one point, I think the strategics will come in, and I hope that will happen soon, where they say, well, most medical device technologies will not be profitable only on the basis of either the US or Europe alone. We need to be transatlantic. And I think that thinking will come back. And if you haven't done anything on MDR for the last 5 years, it comes the time of acquisition. Today, they don't argue that way, but I think in the future, there will come a point where they say, well, you haven't done your homework, we're going to basically pay less. So we cannot forget about Europe, and I would urge people to keep it at the back of their mind, but it's a temporary crisis that we're in right now.
I do find it odd, though, that there's so much money now that is being invested in Europe, and countries are giving so much money in grants, but there doesn't seem to be a tracing of where that money is spent. Because ultimately, if everything is going to the U.S., then it isn't benefiting European citizens, right? And there seems to be a disconnect between the folks who are making those, grant decisions and ultimately seeing where, accountability for where the money's spent. But I mean, you think it's temporary? I mean, does it counter view with regards to MDR? Does anyone see clarity on the horizon with regards to what's happening from a regulatory standpoint? Optimism, folks. No.
Realism.
Well, but there's also an element there, Janke, that you touched on with regards to, what therapies are you actually creating, right? And how does that get implemented in different healthcare systems? And that's where it can also be country by country, and even within the United States, it's different. I think from a traditional, medtech therapeutic standpoint, maybe it's clear. Diagnostics can be challenging. Digital health, I don't know if there is an established modeled yet. I heard, I think Scott Hunnekens, I think he's in the audience. I think he had a really nice quote on a podcast recently saying, you know, one of the major frictions in his career was the challenge of making good choices versus economic choices, right? And Scott, I hope I got that right. Of, you know, just because you have a good therapy doesn't mean it's economically viable for the hospital. And I think it took 20 years for Volcano to get adopted. And so, you know, there's also that. Do you have that assessment in your investment thesis when you're kind of looking at these models, you know, from a traditional medtech standpoint or digital health standpoint? You know, and how do you think about it since digital health is still new, right? You've got you're lacking on the IP side up front, and on the back end, you don't have the exits, you don't have the clinical validation yet. Janke, you want to tackle the medtech side?
I'm happy to do that, although I also cover digital, of course. But you know, I think 10 years ago, most people talked about regulation and how to get FDA approval, and there was very little attention to the market access reimbursement, especially in the early phase. I think that's completely changed. It's almost like the first question or the second question that comes up in a presentation nowadays is like, you know, how does that fit into the current reimbursement landscape? How does the business model work? How are the incentives aligned? And I think it's really good because we have to be realists, right? We want to have a profound impact on patients' lives. We want to make patients' lives better. But if you have a therapy that the system has no way to pay for, it's never going to get to patients. So technologically, it may be very effective and very functional, but if you don't have a way to bring it to patients, it's never going to fly. So it's just as important as the clinical data is to do your homework on the reimbursement side. And of course, you know, it could be that you have to create new codes, that you have to get new coverage, new payment models. But you know, you better start early because those things really take a long time. You better build them into your clinical trial design, that you have a healthcare economic study sort of alongside it, and that it maybe even satisfies both US payers, not just you know, CMS and private, but also European payers' requirements, so that you don't have to do everything sequentially. And I think there we've made a lot of strides forward. The industry as a whole and investors have become a lot less naive about, you know, how to get paid.
So I think you just spoke to, you know, the need for a lot of money, right? So maybe bring this back in the last couple of minutes we have back to the beginning with regards to the need for large amounts of capital, right? And I think obviously there's major headwind now with regards to, you know, U.S. markets being challenged. I mean, there have been some IPOs, I think a recent SPAC, and some money has been raised. In Europe, I know we had discussion preparing for this with regards to what the European public market system should be like, and I think there's different views here. I mean, Sascha, do you want to comment? I mean, with regards to your views on public markets, the availability of an IPO market, and really being able to build and scale companies here in Europe. I think you got, of course, the large strategics in the United States for a long time now, and you haven't had that presence here in Europe, but don't we want that? Don't we need that for the long-term viability of our, you know, of our medtech ecosystem?
Yes, we do. But same as Janke said, I think we all have to be realistic and opportunistic and work with the environment we're working in right now. So yes, I mean there needs to be things done, and there are activities ongoing with the respective regulatory bodies. But I mean, we have to work with the environment we're in, and so I think the best advice is to take the chances which are there and not complain about what could be, right? If so, that's not very entrepreneurial. So yeah,
I would say it's also entrepreneurial to create the future, right? Isn't it our job to create the future and create the environment that we need? So I don't know, other views, Janke, on
So I think we need to definitely upgrade the European capital markets. There's some nice beginnings with Euronext, you know, Nasdaq, Nordic, and but it's not enough, and we're not competitive with the US there, and it's a real disadvantage in the good times that we've had, but even in the bad times. At the same time, I think that it's not so bleak. You know, ARM has shown there is actually an open IPO market right now. If you think big, if you get companies to a scale that is predictable, you can go public even today. Whether it's a good idea to be a public company. That's another question, but you can actually raise a lot of money there. In the US, I think in Europe, we need to really improve things to compete.
Great, thank you. I think we're wrapping up. I think the panel is open for questions. We might hang out after this if anyone has questions. Any final advice for folks in the audience?
I'll go back to what Janke was saying on around incentives and alignment. I think that's really, really important, at least in the US, to understand it. And it's not straightforward. Being in digital, if you're selling to employers or at risk, they have insurers have lives for 2.5 years. Something to keep in mind when you're designing your product. When you sell into hospitals, how are you going to use, like for the OR, how much are you going to create some profitability in addition to reimbursement? So I think as you're looking at US investors, that's one of the first questions. We'll look at IP behind. We'll look at the regulatory environment, of course. But how do you align incentives across the ecosystem is really important.
Great point. Thank you. Stay hungry, stay foolish. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the show. Enjoy Barcelona.
Thank you, Manu.
Thank you, everyone.